Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you here and being part of this conversation on how do we address issues to do with financing for children, especially at the critical moment like this, as the world seeks to find solutions to the climate crisis. My name is Malama Mwira. I'm the Regional Head of Policy Advocacy and Campaigns at Save the Children International. So thank you once again for joining us today for this crucial dialogue, like I said, on addressing climate financing gap for children, and organized, of course, by Save the Children International. And I would like to thank, of course, the World Bank as well for supporting and hosting this event in this pavilion, and all the panelists joining us as well. The climate crisis, as we know, children have least contributed to this crisis, and yet they are the ones who face the brunt of it. It's very important that we take that into account. Research that indicates that 774 million children globally face the double burden of climate change and poverty. So these two interconnected crisis issues are very important for us to address, and particularly maybe using the climate financing conversation. It is very urgent as well to ensure that we prevent an increase as well in child poverty at the same time. Children are not passive victims of the climate crisis, and that's why we have Doris with us here, who is going to speak to us about what children as well are doing. Apart from obviously just experiencing this climate crisis, they are obviously taking action as well. The World Bank obviously as well estimates that climate change will push an additional 130 million people into poverty in the next 10 years. This would exacerbate the number of children exposed to the two interconnected crisis issues, poverty as well as the climate risk as well. In terms of financing, the recent report, Falling Short, published by Save the Children, which my colleague will speak to, and as well when our partners like UNICEF, SERI, Plan and Capita highlights a stark reality that only 2.4% of climate finance from key multilateral funds projects with child-responsive activities. This underlines the urgent need to bridge the gap in child-responsive climate financing. In terms of investing in children, one of the critical issues that needs to be addressed is that we need to address the evidence that shows that public spending on children particularly is still remaining a challenge. It's mostly one of the key challenges, that is the public spending is not benefiting children, their communities as well. So this needs to be addressed. The objectives in terms of the conversations that we are going to have would look at raising awareness, of course, on what are the critical issues. That's what Doris will speak to, especially in terms of emphasizing the importance of considering children in climate finance. So they should be available to speak on the issues that affect them. They know better where the funds should go. So that's very important. We should also hopefully facilitate dialogue to bring together, obviously, expertise to ensure that these conversations are happening. Part of the conversations for us as an organization that we want to ensure we drive to is around the global stocktake process. Next year, as the SBI 60th session takes place, we're strongly advocating, for example, that there should be an expert dialogue on children to bring these issues together, because it's very important that as we've had expert dialogues on various thematic areas in the past, the children who are the most critical constituency are also given that space to be able to bring these issues together, and that the world takes note of that. In terms of identifying the way forward, we will collaboratively explore pathways for NGOs, the multilateral development banks, UN agencies, governments to work together in increasing child-responsive climate finance. In terms of where we go next, in terms of our agenda today, we will hear from a child climate activist, Doris. Thank you very much, Doris.
Thank you.
And then we will then also hear from Kelly, my colleague at Save the Children. She's the Global Director for Climate, Child Poverty, and Urban at Save the Children, where she will share the results of the Falling Short report already mentioned. Then we will have a panel discussion between our government representative from the government of Slovenia, as well as the World Bank representative as well in this particular conversation, and our colleague Stefan from the World Bank, who closed the event. Yeah. So as I hand over and invite Doris, I think it's important to say that it cannot be said enough that investing in children in climate resilience is not just a moral imperative, it is an investment that is sustainable and equitable as well. They are the ones who are going to be here in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So it's important that we invest now. We look forward to a fruitful conversation and looking forward to the expert opinions from the panel that we have with us. So allow me to introduce Doris. Doris is a 14-year-old child from Zambia. She started working on climate change when she was just 13 years old. She comes from an area which is affected by floods and droughts. Depending on the season, one season there will be a drought, the other season there will be a flood. When an area floods, children often don't go to school. And often enough, due to poor road networks, it means even basic floods would cut off entire areas. But I will allow her, of course, to speak a lot more about her experience around those issues, but also in terms of the critical access to water sources, for example, that does impact her and her community. So, Doris, I welcome you to share with us your experience on the climate crisis.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Doris Hammond. I'm 14 years old, and I live in Choma, in Southern Province in Zambia. I'm very happy to be here at COP28 to talk about climate change and how it is affecting our rights as children. I'm also happy that I'm representing other children in Zambia. As Zambian children, we had a meeting where we discussed how climate change is affecting us, and some of other things that we discussed is water and sanitation. We children have a right to safe and clean water according to Article 24 on our right to health and SDG 6. But we children, we are facing challenges due to lack of water and sanitation facilities in our schools and community. Like in schools, some of our schools in Zambia have no piped water, and we have to use boreholes. Some of our schools have no flush toilets. They use Tipra twins. Girls have diseases which is called fungal diseases. And girls miss school due to lack of menstrual hygiene facilities because at school we don't have enough water. And boys, it hurts their pride to use toilet where there is no privacy. In community, within our communities, people use well to draw water. With climate change, we are experiencing a lot of heat, which is causing wells and rivers to dry up. It causes water shortage in our community. As a result, where the girl child spends a lot of hours looking for water. Sometimes we miss school. Sometimes we are very tired to concentrate to school. During our time of collecting water, we are vulnerable to abuse and violence. This is why we need finance to ensure that us children have access to safe, clean, and available water at school and at home. Another reason why we need investment in water. We need water for agriculture to grow crops. In Zambia, we mainly depend on rain, but when there is no rain, our parents can't grow crops. For example, in Southern Province, where I come from, we face a lot of drought and millions of people are affected. For example, in Gwembe, there was hunger recently, and children like me were affected with climate change. We're likely to experience more droughts. This is why we need finance for water to use for irrigation, droughts, food insecurity. As children also want to plant trees in our schools, but if we don't have water, it will be difficult for us to plant trees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doris. Thank you for your inspirational words around your experiences around how you face climate change in your community. And as you can see from what Doris has shared, climate change manifests itself in different ways in different countries and different contexts and different communities as well. In one community, it could have a different impact, but in Doris's experience, a lack of water because of a drought will signify a lot of different impacts in terms of failing, for example, to go to school because they have to walk long distances to go and fetch water. By the time they get back home, it's too late for them to go to school. But she also spoke about the conversations around health, an increase in terms of health. I did earlier mention around that it's not just a moral imperative that we finance for children and in terms of the climate crisis, but she also spoke about, for example, one of the dignity issues. Not having water in a school means that most children will not, especially the girl child, won't go to school because they will not be able to have access to proper sanitation facilities in a school. So that's very important, and thank you very much for sharing your experience, Doris.
Thank you.
And now I would like to invite Kelly, the Global Director for Climate, Child Poverty and Urban at Save the Children, who will share with us the key results of the Falling Short report. Kelly?
Well, thank you very much, Malama and Doris, for setting out so clearly why it's vital that children are at the heart of our response to the climate crisis. So we know that children have done least to cause climate change, but are most affected by it. We also know that investing in children gives us long-term returns, not just for children, but for their communities and countries. And yet this Falling Short report published by the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative showed that just 2.4% of climate finance from key climate funds supports projects that incorporate child-responsive interventions. So what do we mean by child-responsive climate finance? So we consider three criteria. First of all, that it explicitly and meaningfully considers children and how they are uniquely affected by climate change. Secondly, that it strengthens the resilience of essential social services that children depend on, so water and sanitation, health, education, social protection, and disaster risk reduction. And thirdly, that it's inclusive of children in all of their diversity and really incorporates their strengths and activism as well. So this report was the first ever child-focused analysis of the international climate funds. It looked at all 591 projects approved over a 17-year period, and that's about $51.5 billion worth of programs from these 4 key climate funds. Now, we know that these climate funds they provide just actually a small percentage of all of the finance that's going into climate change, but they're critical because they are grant funding primarily focused at adaptation in the communities where people are most affected by climate change. And so they really set the tone and the direction for other climate finance that's out there. So what were the findings? Overall, we found that just 2.4% of the funding, this $51.5 billion, addressed all of those 3 criteria I set out on climate finance being child responsive. Another 8.5% demonstrated it in certain areas, but that left 89%, or about $46 billion, which failed to address the needs of children. Looking at the 3 criteria directly, explicit and meaningful consideration of children was only made in 13% of projects, and that dropped to just 4% when we consider girls explicitly. 9% of those projects looked at children primarily as a vulnerable group, with only 4% looking at them as agents of change. In terms of strengthening the resilience of essential social services for children, education was the sector that was most considered in 13% of programs, but only one of those projects tackled education primarily, although I know there's now been an additional project approved very recently by the Green Climate Fund specifically focused on education. But it's really shocking to see just how little of the health and social protection needs were addressed, both in less than 1% of projects. And thirdly, inclusion of children as important stakeholders only took place in 12% of projects. So how can we scale up climate finance for children? We can look at this by scaling up the child and gender responsiveness of climate finance. So we need more and better climate finance, more grant funding for adaptation and loss and damage, and having specific funding windows for children would really help address that funding is focused on children's needs. Being very strategic in terms of investing in these child-critical social services and ensuring that children are participating meaningfully in these projects. Secondly, by bolstering child-responsive approaches, We really believe that instituting a child marker would help us measure how many programs are really addressing the needs of children, just like we have a gender marker, and that's really proven effective. Also having dedicated policies on children and child critical social services within these key climate funds. Requiring child rights impact assessments as part of the design of programs, and ensuring that key national policies such as NDCs are child and gender responsive. And thirdly, making sure that we're building the capacity, coordination and partnerships, so working with children and child rights agencies to ensure that these needs of children are tackled within climate funds. So change is happening. There's one of the projects that's given as a case study in the program is the Vanuatu Community Climate Change Resilience Program, which I had the honor of visiting recently. And this included consultations with children as part of the design of the program. It's working on child critical social services across a number of sectors with a focus on food security and livelihood, specifically to tackle the needs, children's nutritional needs, and is very inclusive of children as stakeholders in the program. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Kelly. Very valid examples of meaningful ways that we could put in place to ensure that climate financing is working for children. That leads us to a very critical point of our conversation, and that is me inviting the other key speakers that we have, of course, on the panel. So I'll start with introducing Smiljana. She's a diplomat and ambassador at large for climate diplomacy representing the government of Slovenia. And then we also have Stefan, a senior climate change advisor at the World Bank. And I did introduce Kelly earlier on, but I can also introduce her again. She's the Global Director for Climate, Child Poverty, and Urban at Save the Children. So thank you very much, panelists, for taking up this conversation and joining this important dialogue on how we can make climate finance work for children. So, Stefan, I'm going to start with you. The World Bank, in terms of the kind of projects that the World Bank sort of has been taking on, and maybe prospectively going forward, what are the kind of projects that the World Bank seeks to support to ensure that they benefit children in terms of their climate finance impacts, of course? And what steps are being taken to increase this focus? I think Kelly spoke a bit about having a specific focus, including having trackers. So it's very important, perhaps we hear from you, how the World Bank is trying to achieve that in the various projects that the World Bank is implementing.
And first, let me thank you for having me here. I think it's a really, really important topic. I think a lot of people at COP are working on climate because of children, right? So it's good to have a session on that topic. The problem of targeting climate finance where it matters is, of course, really, really important. Maybe we also want to expand the discussions to finance in general and to development finance, because maybe the point I wanted to make to open is that not only children are more vulnerable to all of those impacts, but children of poor parents are like orders of magnitude more vulnerable to those challenges. And what you see is children living in poor families not being able to be protected against those impacts are much more likely to be poor themselves as a result of that. And then you get this cycle of poverty at the family level, which if something is unfair, I mean, this is really unfair, right? You're just born to poor parents and you have not the opportunity to escape poverty. So I think one of the key questions also is how do we combine this climate finance with development finance, with poverty reduction, so that we also have targeted interventions on those most vulnerable children. You asked about the tagging. We have been working with tags for gender, but also for climate, with our climate co-benefits for a long time. I think what we see now is that we also need to move to a measure of the actual output and outcomes of those interventions. It's not only how much you put into the system, it's really how well designed are your projects to make sure you get a lot of benefits out of it. And so there is a question to me also linked to the data collection we're doing, for instance, in household surveys, so that we better capture within families who is affected by what, the vulnerability of different members, children, but I mean, elderly is also one very important dimension, and move from just tracking the inputs to tracking those outcomes. So I'm completely with you that we need a better tracking system. We also need to better understand how we look at the effect of what we're doing to make sure we're using those scarce resources as efficiently as possible.
Thank you very much for that elaborate answer. I think from what I'm getting from you, it's important that we don't see financing also as in terms of silos, but we look at how everything can be interconnected and brought together. So that leads me to my question to Smiana from your government perspective. What challenges and opportunities does your government see in terms of increasing climate financing to social sectors that support children? So the sectors maybe Stefan referred to, but I would want to zero in particularly on health, education, social protection, among the other pieces. Because, for example, what Stefan mentioned, the issue of child poverty has a bigger issue above it. Like if you are born in a household which is poor, most likely you will end up being trapped in there unless proper interventions are put in place. So it will be interesting to hear from you, Smiana, from your government perspective on how we can do better with that.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Doris, for testimony and this really very helpful analysis that you made in Save the Children. Of course, it's about many issues. It's about empowerment of children. We have in Slovenia a network of so-called eco-schools for several years now, but not all schools are involved. And these eco-schools have really interesting projects and a lot of awareness raising. And then the government also has a program for the whole sector of education, for the footprint of the schools, but also for the empowerment of children. Because without knowledge, we don't have empowerment. If children are not aware of what is going on, they cannot be an agent of change, I think. So this is education. Then on social issues, I would just like to mention, of course, it's broader. It's not just about children, it's about families, it's about protection of most vulnerable. It is about just energy transition. We have recently boosted our eco fund that delivers grants and loans for energy transition, so helping family better insulate their buildings, better to switch to friendlier, climate-friendlier energy sources. So this is another issue that is really helpful in social area. And when it comes to health, I would just like to mention a concrete challenge that we faced after the recent floods in Slovenia, which were by far the worst ever in our history. And in one particular area that was hit by those floods is the area when previously lead mines were. And children were 3 years old were measured for the level of the lead in their blood. And government, because the floods changed the whole configuration of the area, so now this measurement of the level of the lead in the blood of 3 years old, it has now been expanded to much greater area. So that we are controlling it, and it goes ups and downs, and this is sort of a hazardous area in our case, but the government reacted swiftly. So these are the challenges the government has to count on when big floods came or where this drought. That's complete different health challenges. So I hope I just pictured a little bit of what we are doing in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I think the next point that Kelly will share with us will also look at, perhaps in terms of the interventions that your government has put in place, how do we also ensure that children are involved in terms of the decision-making process? Because obviously, in my tribe, they say the one who has the wound is the one who knows how painful it is. You can constitute a panel of experts and say, if someone's hand is cut off, this is how painful it can be. But the quicker way of getting a solution is ask them, what's the scale of your pain? And so therefore, even in terms of the conversations and the interventions that need to take place, it's interesting to think about how do we get voices of children particularly, and especially those children who are most affected by inequality and discrimination. Because in most countries, and I think you probably would agree that even in your country, it's not all children are affected the same way. So some are affected more than others because of specific predispositions that they may face, whether maybe because they are a girl or maybe because they are a boy or they're living in displacement. So Kelly, how do we ensure that vulnerable voices are also taken into account in terms of climate financing?
So thanks, Malama. There was some great case studies on how this has been done, set out in the Falling Short report. So the first way is ensuring that children are involved in the design and monitoring of programs. And I've already mentioned the GCF-funded Vanuatu program, which consulted with children's groups as part of the design. There's also another GCF project on water efficiency in Jordan, which actually selected its implementing partners based on their plans to involve children through innovative means such as art, quizzes, and school activities. Secondly, ensuring that children are aware of the issues of climate change and have the information they need to become involved. And there was a special Climate Change Fund-funded community resilience program in Namibia, which added climate-smart agriculture to the school curriculum. And that program found that the families of these children adopted these approaches, and families that had girl children, in particular girls, were particularly affected at sharing these knowledge with their communities. Then finally, supporting child-led activities. So there was an LDC-funded ecosystem-based adaptation project in Nepal that ran competitions for children to design and identify and implement their own climate adaptation projects that were supported by the program. And the children were given support in terms of how they were going to collect data, monitor, and see the impacts of their program. So lots of innovative examples out there of how we can make sure children are genuinely involved in this work.
Yeah, thank you very much. And as you are speaking, I'm thinking to myself, I should possibly try and frame a question. It wasn't initially prepared for, but because what you've said, I think reminds me of the conversation that Doris and the other children have been having, and I like asking them this question as well. So Doris, if the government or the World Bank was to give you the money that was needed in your community, where would you spend it in the context of climate change in your community? What would you do with the money? I mean, imagining, I don't know whether the World Bank gives $1 billion US, but if they gave $1 billion US to your community, what would you do with it?
Thank you. I'll start from in our schools. We'll spend the money in our schools to bring taps in our schools for water, like water pipes, and build more toilets, like flushing toilets, and in our community to bring also taps so that people would be going long distances to go and fetch for water, supplying taps everywhere in the community, and bring electricity power, because like in our school, we don't have a laboratory for computer. We don't have, so if in terms of learning computer, if you don't know, then it's nothing. So we don't have computers in our schools, so we can spend that on buying computers, building laboratories and science labs, and that's where we can spend our money.
Right, thank you very much. So the solutions are there. The children know where to spend the money. And a lot of these things are very much connected, because if they are not in schools, they're not learning about the we are talking about technology, I think, and this is one of the things I'm picking from what she's saying. We're talking about innovation and technology, but if children, for example, are living and are studying in a school where they don't even have access to a computer, I think in some schools in Zambia, and I'm from Zambia as well, like Doris, I know in some schools they learn about computers as a theory. So they learn about computers on a paper. So it's a struggle to imagine how we use innovation and technology in terms of addressing the climate crisis when we're not investing in the technology that the children need to learn about the innovative ways that the world can deal with the climate crisis. So having said that, thank you very much, Doris. I want to invite Stefan to maybe to share his perspectives in terms of how we can do better in terms of incorporating child-responsive activities in climate finance projects, and what strategies you think could be effective.
Well, maybe a few things, and I think that all of your points, I think, really show us how this question is not only a climate question, but very much a question of just basic development and how to provide people and children with a better life. So one of the first points I would like to make is when we look at this climate finance, there is a question of how do we make 1 + 1 being more than 2, right? How do we use that climate finance, including what's targeting interventions towards children, to help do everything else we're doing, all of the policies in countries, all of the investments from domestic resources or from international development resources, being better at taking into account climate, natural risks, and those long-term issues. So you mentioned schools, for instance. All countries are investing quite a lot in schools. How does this money in climate finance can make sure all of the schools are looking into the questions you're asking? How do we make the schools able to provide an environment where children can learn when it's super hot, right? We have data, very strong data showing in many cases children cannot learn because it's just too hot in the schools. So we need to use these resources we have to do this little, maybe it's just like 2-3% more that we have to spend on those schools. And it makes a whole difference because then children can learn. And we can also use the school to target children. Because one of the challenges we have, it's true for data, but it's also true for a lot of social protection. Everything is at the scale of the household. So you help a household, and it's important, and we need that. But, I mean, the distribution within the households we don't see, right? It's often a very black box. Even our data doesn't allow us to understand how those supports can go to different members. School are a place where we can actually target children. And Doris, your points, I think, are really going in that direction, right? We know who the beneficiaries will be, and we know they are the beneficiaries that we want. So I think my main suggestion is really to understand how do we combine those different sources of finance so that we're doing the right thing, and not only trying to have, because this climate finance will always be too small for what we need, right? So it works only if it leverages all of the other investments, and it's not only development finance, it's also domestic resources. And finally, maybe a last point, and I sort of like hate to be the economist to say that, but sometimes you need to build coalitions, right? There is an imperative to do it, but if you look at the long-term growth pathways of those countries, it's all about children, right? In the end of the day, your development is your people in 20, in 30 years. So at the World Bank, we have created this human capital index, which is doing what we all wish would not be necessary, but to put a very quantified economic argument on this. Like when you invest in those things, it's not only making the life of children better, but if you're only concerned about your long-term economic growth and your tax revenues and so on, this is also the right thing to do. Those are great investments. And I think the strength of this topic is really that it is a topic where we can bring the moral imperative and the long-term pure economic arguments together, and we can build coalitions that really range this whole scope of people with different jobs and different views and different focuses to really make sure we make a big difference. So I hope we have much more discussion through that angle, because I think it can move the needle not only for the funds that you have been looking at, but really way beyond it. So thank you very much for having it, and thanks, Doris, to have like these very concrete proposals, because climate finance, a lot of things here are very abstract, and getting the concreteness is really what we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Stefan. It's very important that we are very concrete and targeted, like you've said. Sometimes it's not about the scale of the investment, but investing in the right spaces, in the right places, because then there are times when we invest a little, but it goes a long way because we've invested at the right time, the right space, as well as getting the right targets. So thank you very much for that. We will be getting close to the end of the conversation, at least for this particular moment, but it's important to note that in a way it also feels like it's a big start, especially with some of the pronouncements that have been made. And as an organization, Save the Children is looking forward to seeing, for example, how these conversations around the Loss and Damage Fund, for example, would also help accelerate some of those conversations. And we look forward to seeing some of that targeted investment, hitting the right places so that children who are most affected by inequality and discrimination benefit the most. because that's when we make impact for the future. I want to invite maybe a last round of just any comments you might have in case there's one particular element that stands out for you. I'll start with Smihana, and then I'll move this way, and then I'll get back to you for your closing remarks.
Thank you. I really believe I replied, of course, first on this very concrete questions, but it is always very important to have a regulatory framework in all, of our countries. To have, right to clean, healthy environment embedded, inscribed into the constitution, into the legislation, the right to clean, drinkable water as well, to have legislation in place, and of course to have children part of the strategies that you prepare. You mentioned participation. This is important. We have our own children's parliament that gathers once a year, I think, in our main parliament room. And it is part of intergenerational justice, as you have mentioned. So what we should do also for the generations that come. And in development aid, I agree here as well. In development partnerships, for example, in Slovenia, we focus on food security, water security, very much so. And children, this is more on security, again, on security aspects. We will focus on also in the UN Security Council when we will start our non-permanent membership. So it is about everything. It's a wide area of work. We cannot discuss in depth into now in this half an hour time, but I think it is important to have it in regulation, but then also to have it in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a very good example of participation and why it's important to mainstream it and make it as part of institutional governance as well. The Children's Parliament you've given as an example from Slovenia, we see valid examples of how much impact those kind of structures can have, because the children are very invested in the future. And thank you very much for your example and the good leadership the government of Slovenia is providing in that particular space. And we look forward to seeing more of that example, as you've said, getting into the sort of permanent Security Council membership as well. So hopefully that translates to good examples to the other countries that are not doing the same. Kelly, your conclusions.
Thanks. I just wanted to reinforce Stefan's comments about the partnership between the moral imperative and a rights-based approach and the economic argument behind focusing on children. So we know that children have done the least to cause climate change, but particularly children in lower and middle income countries and children affected by inequality and discrimination are most affected by climate change. And children like Doris all over the world are rising up and taking action to address the climate crisis. And their right to participate is enshrined within the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And how we can ensure that happens is set out in the General Comment 26. But we also know that investing in children is the way that we get the biggest bang for our buck. So investing in children gives us really long-term impact at scale, and that's what we need to address this huge crisis that's facing us today.
Thank you very much for that. And Doris?
Thank you. We are looking forward to see good change in our country and in our schools so that we can enjoy our rights. And we can enjoy our rights to education when there are good materials which are needed to use, like in computers, as I said. So I'm looking forward to see good change in our country and in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's a very specific expectation. It's not a very hard expectation, to be honest. I think if we just set our priorities right, we will be able to deliver change for children in the right and meaningful way. So thank you very much, everyone, for a fruitful conversation. I want to invite Stefan to sort of close for us with any other final remarks from your end. Then we are done.
Well, I can be relatively short. I think one thing that is striking to me is, so we had one big event on health at this COP. And then we have like a day on education, and I mean we have those like very sectoral distribution of our discussions. In a way, it's very powerful to start with children, right? And to get that right, you really need all of these buckets to be right. And when we try to convince people to really put resources, and it's not only finance and economics, right? It's the political capital that people making decisions will decide to put into that question. I think having this audience targeted like you're doing here, I think is very useful. We talked a lot about schools and education. We did not talk a lot about health, but I mean the vulnerability of children even before they are born is something, again, when we have very clear data, and again for very little amount of resources, it's entire lives over decades that you can transform if you act at the right time and at the right place. So identifying those things, I think, is really absolutely critical. And to conclude, we talked mostly about adaptation and risk and vulnerability, but of course, there is a question on the political economy of reducing emissions and fixing climate change, and how, for a challenge that is such more about the long run, how do you get new voices? And this is again a case where I think climate can sort of like open the way more generally, because countries are facing more and more long-term challenges. And the question of how do you get a more like inclusive way of, especially for children who will be experiencing the consequences of our decision now in the future. I think this question of how do you get the governance right, you don't want to duplicate governance bodies that exist already in countries. So you want to use climate, try to transform governance in countries to give a much more balanced voice and have the voice of young people. But you have to be very careful, because you create expectations. And if we just listen but don't act on what has been said, then the disappointment is here, and it can backfire pretty hard. So I think we really need a commitment when we start to engage, and we have all of those processes where we listen to children and to all of the different stakeholders, right? That then you need to make the commitments to act upon what is being said. Otherwise, it's even more frustration. So I really think that we can not only have those discussions and listen to learn, but also really make something about it. Yeah. Thank you.
Action, right? Let's make action. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for a wonderful discussion, and looking forward to taking these conversations forward with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.